Hello friends, today we'll see about the clustering techniques from unit 6. In that we'll see first hierarchical clustering. Hierarchical clustering is also represented by the dendrograms, and in that we have some subparts, that is agglomerative clustering and divisive clustering. Before going to hierarchical clustering, first we'll see about the clusters. Already we have seen about the clusters, but in brief I will tell you about the clusters. Clusters are the group of the objects which are having less distance between them, or the objects within one cluster are similar to each other, and the objects or the data points which are in the different clusters are dissimilar, or we can say the distance between them is large. That are the clusters we have seen already. Now we'll see about the hierarchy. What do you mean by hierarchy? Hierarchy is nothing but the we can say the layers. For example, in college we have a management. After management, closer to the management we have principal team. Then after principal, closer to principal we have HODs. Then we have faculties, and then we have students. Now what we have to do in the hierarchical clustering? We have to group this hierarchy into a single cluster. Right? How? That we'll see now. Here we have management, principal, HODs, faculties and students. These are our data points, right? Now, or we can say these are the clusters. Now, according to the hierarchical clustering, what we have to do? We have here plotted like a management team, principal, HOD, faculties and students. Now, in these data points or in these clusters, we can say these single data points are the clusters initially, right? So, the one cluster is a management, another cluster is a principal, another is a heads, then faculties and then students. Now if we see these things, the heads and faculties are closer to each other than the other things, right? And the principal and management team is closer to each other. They are having less distance between them. They are closer to each other. So what we did? We did one cluster, one group, that is a management and principal, depends on the closeness between them. And then we have another cluster, another group, that is head and the faculties, right? Then to the head and faculties, which is the closer? Students cluster or student group is closer to head and faculties. So we have created one cluster together, head and faculty cluster and the student cluster together. And to all these, the management and principal team is closer. So finally we have one single cluster, that is a management, principal, head, faculties and students, right? And all that comes in a one college on one organization, right? And this type of a representation, whatever the representation we have shown here, like these vertical lines and horizontal lines, this type of a representation are called as a dendrograms, right? So in hierarchical clustering, the hierarchical clusters representation is shown by dendrograms always. So that is also called as a dendrogram clustering, right? So here we have one cluster, management, principal, heads and faculties, then depends on the similarity we have head, faculty, students, and finally we have a single cluster, right? Now here we have two types of a method, that is agglomerative and divisive. We'll see now what do you mean by agglomerative clustering and what do you mean by divisive clustering. In agglomerative clustering, we are using the bottom-up approach. What do you mean by bottom-up approach now? Here, initially, every data point we are showing as a single cluster. We are going bottom to up. That means, initially we are having every data items as a single cluster. Then depends on the similarity, we are grouping we are creating a cluster of these two clusters. Now remember here in hierarchical clustering, we are doing the clustering of the clusters, right? Here we are saying that my management, principal, heads, faculties and students are one clusters. Then we are finding the similarity between the clusters. We are finding the similarity between management and principal, management and heads, management and faculties, management and students. Then who is closer to the management? Principal. So we have one cluster here, management management and principal. Then we are having the principal who is closer. So likewise we have to form a clusters here. So we are having initially management principal cluster, heads and faculties cluster, and likewise finally we are having management principal head and faculties cluster. So we are using bottom up approach. Bottom up approach, initially every data item is a single cluster, and then we are finding the similarity between the clusters by using same distance formula, that is a Euclidean distance formula. So we are using here Euclidean distance formula or Manhattan's. It depends on which type of data you have in your cluster. So by measuring the similarity between the clusters, we are having here bottom up approach. So whenever we are using bottom up approach in a hierarchical clustering, that type of a clustering is called as a agglomerative clustering, right? After that we have to see divisive approach. What is a divisive approach? Opposite to agglomerative, that is a top down approach. In a top down approach, initially we are having all the data points in a one cluster. So all data points are in one cluster, and then depends on the similarity, we are dividing that cluster. We are dividing the cluster into two clusters. That is, one cluster is MP and another is HFS. Then MP is divided into so we have to divide the cluster till we get a single item into the cluster. That type of approach is called as a top down approach. But generally we are using agglomerative method only. That is a bottom up approach, right? And here we are creating a cluster of the clusters, right? How that we'll see now how it works. So I think you are clear with the agglomerative and divisive approach. And what do you mean by hierarchical clustering? The data items are given, we are considering data items are the clusters, and we are forming the cluster of the clusters. Depends on the hierarchy. In hierarchy we have the which is closer to which data item or which cluster. Management cluster is closer to principal cluster is closer to HOD is closer to faculty is closer to students. And using this hierarchy, we are having finally a single cluster, and we are calling that cluster as a college, or we are calling it as a organization, any, right? Now we'll see how it works, right? How it works. First step, make each data point a cluster. So I have just plotted the data points, and each data point is representing a cluster. As we have seen here, each data point is forming a cluster. So we are having here each data point is a cluster here, right? Now we can see here in the second step, take the two closest cluster and make them one cluster. So we can see here directly these two clusters are closer to each other, right? Then we can say these two clusters are closer to each other. Then we can say that these three are in a one cluster, right? So likewise we have to make the clusters which are closer to each other, right? Now in third step, repeat this step 2 until there is only one cluster. So we have to repeat the step 2. Here I have created the cluster because these two data items are closer, these two clusters are closer, one cluster. Then I have created the cluster of these three, and then finally I'm having a single cluster. That process is called as a hierarchical clustering, right? Now here these hierarchical clustering will be represented by the dendrograms. How we can have here the dendrograms. Now here we can see the dendrogram, like these are the data points, and depends on the similarity we can show these hierarchical clustering in the form of dendrograms, right? Now we'll see how to create these clusters, or how to actually implement the hierarchical clustering with the example in my next video. This is about the concept of hierarchical clustering. I hope you all are clear with the hierarchical clustering. Thank you.